So, so one of the disadvantages of going in the afternoon, of course, is that many of the things that you want to say have already been touched on earlier. So you could say that my talk this afternoon, I'm standing on the shoulders of phenomenological razors and giants that we've heard already, and hopefully I won't topple off of those shoulders, but the one salvation I have is that my paper is very topical. So it will be sort of, looking at some of the things we've talked about already, but in a context of that's sort of newsworthy today, I guess you could say. So in recent intra-ecclesial discussions, conscience, my topic, is often treated as a faculty of deliberation serving as a counterbalance to the potentially or supposedly alienating and moralistic effects of the Church's traditional doctrines, especially in the area of sexuality. Earlier understandings of conscience are criticized as deductivistic, as conceiving of conscience's function as merely applying an external and universal law, and thereby as failing to account for conscience's active role in responding to the concrete and varied situations of actual men and women of flesh and blood in a changing world. These criticisms have become common in the years following Humanae Vitae, indeed foreshadowed in the so-called majority report preceding Humanae Vitae, and have grown more prominent recently. 30 years ago, Veritatis Splendor warned of a growing tendency to replace conscience's task of making judgments of actions with that of making decisions about the Church's teachings, and to think that this decision-making process signals the arrival of the faithful's moral maturity in the modern world. The encyclical further criticized claims that the Church's traditional teachings are excessively categorical and deductive, and that they are the cause of unnecessary conflicts of conscience. While there are many examples of this recent trend, I will cite only the criticisms and remedies proposed by Cardinal Robert McElroy of San Diego in America magazine last January. So you see how topical this is, in anticipation of the Synod on synodality. While the article is hardly an extended statement and wasn't intended to be an extended statement on conscience, it did lay bare some of the tendencies of the trend as it has unfolded. It further received much attention given the Cardinal's prominence, and it was clearly published for the purpose of influencing the Synod participants and their constituencies, and presumably it did have some influence. In his article, the Cardinal said that Catholic teaching must play a critical role in the decision-making of believers. It is conscience that has the privileged place. He then went on to say that church teachings, which often work as structures of exclusion, may undermine conscience's privilege because they cannot encompass the inner conversation between women and men and God. The idea that conscience is, at its deepest level, a conversation with God is not unique to McElroy, nor is it a new one. Veritatis Splendor also refers to conscience as a dialogue of man with God, the author of the law, the primordial image and final end of man. More prominently, both Veritatis Splendor and Gaudium et Spes speak of conscience as a place where the voice of God may be heard. Moral conscience, the encyclical tells us, does not close man within an insurmountable and impenetrable solitude, but opens to the call of the voice of God. And this, and not in anything else, lies the entire mystery of the dignity of the moral conscience, in being the place, the sacred place where God speaks to man. So that's Veritatis Splendor. For its part, Gaudium et Spes teaches us that man's conscience is his most secret core and sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. So McElroy's statement would seem to be drawing on that. Presupposed by these passages and others like them is the idea that the dialogue with God is a guarantee of the openness and conscience to truth, which is distilled, represented, and objectified in God's moral law and the church's teaching. Here, the law and teaching are not conceived as lying outside the dialogue, but at its core insofar as they are a representation of truth, a truth necessary for authentic personal flourishing. But in Cardinal McElroy's hands, moral truth appears to have taken a subordinate role in its representation in church teaching, and its representation in church teaching seems to exist outside the conversation with God. He appears to depict the situation as follows. There's a moral agent who is confronted with the decision about the course of his life in relation to the faith and participation in the church's sacramental life. The decision involves confrontation with the moral teaching of the church, which would be burdensome to follow and therefore presents a stumbling block for full participation on the basis, and on that basis constitutes an exclusion, a principle of exclusion. But in addition to and separate from the church's moral doctrine, there is also individual conscience, which is, at least in part, constituted as an inner dialogue with God about what is to be done, given concrete circumstances of the agent's particular situation, which the teaching of the church, the moral law, which by its nature is general and universal, cannot anticipate, since in the case of practical reason, universals cannot anticipate all particulars. Hence, to submit the moral agent to the universality of the teaching would bypass the dialogue with God, which should be given priority and which can take the particularities of individual situations into account. McElroy's argument, brief as it is, invites us to think about conscience and its relation to moral truth, and in particular, natural law, since the church's teaching in the central areas of concern, and which are the basis for the questions about full participation in the sacraments, are typically at their root matters of natural law. Like Cardinal McElroy, Karol Wojtyła was, in his philosophical works, critical of deductivistic conceptions of conscience or positivistic impositions of moral law. So, quote, he says, in Person and Act, he says, he asserts that from the position of the integral experience of man as a person, the function of conscience should not be reduced to a mechanism of deducing or applying norms whose truthfulness would inhere in abstract formulas, possibly codified as far as the positive legal order is concerned. He adds that later that it would be inhuman to impose moral law or duty by external pressure. Wojtyła hardly proposes, therefore, using participation in the sacramental life of the church as a stick to batter the marginalized. So for Wojtyła, like McElroy, conscience is conceived as playing a central and active role in the drama of human life. And yet Wojtyła, as we shall see, takes conscience far more seriously than McElroy, for his conception of its role places it more fundamentally at the center of the conception of personhood, its secret core, as Gaudium et Spes had put it and Veritatis Splendor had reiterated. For Wojtyła, the actor recognizes moral truth from within the experience of himself in relation to his action and through his personal openness to the world, and it is the recognition of truth in relation to others and to God through a fundamental act of recognition and acceptance of what Wojtyła calls the truth of the good, that the duty of fidelity to moral law arises. As he puts it, the function of conscience consists in designating the true good in the act, and the proper and complete function of conscience consists in subjecting the act to truth. This entails the subjection of self-determination, that is, a freedom of the will, to the true good, or rather the subjection of it to the good in truth. It is for this reason, according to Wojtyła, that the act is a privileged revelation or disclosure of the person. The act makes concrete and in some sense real this encounter with truth. In support of this thesis, Wojtyła offers an extensive anthropology of conscience without the antinomian and situationalist implications of McElroy's argument. My goal this afternoon is to argue that it is in the very dialogue with God that the question of moral truth arises, and therefore also the question of God's law, which ought not to be understood as positivistically imposed by the church in separation from the inner dialogue. In doing so, I hope to draw out Wojtyła's understanding of conscience, and in particular, as my title indicates, of conscience as a commitment to reality. As do the traditional formulations, Wojtyła holds that conscience is a complex reality involving various depths, as we've already seen today. Also, like the tradition, he associates the scholastic concept of synderesis with one of those levels, namely the possession and operation of the first principle of the practical order. However, he does not see this level, which he characterizes as the practical aspect of conscience, as the deepest level of ethical and moral intellection. Rather, he sees it as the operation of a human conscience in conveying knowledge of the good into concrete acts directed toward particular objects. Synderesis commands us to do good and avoid evil, but Wojtyła holds that it does not tell us what is good or what is evil. This normative, as he tells us in the 1972 manuscript, Man in the Field of Responsibility, which was not published until 1991, the first principle of the practical order, synderesis, is more than anything the principle of transferring an answer already prepared for the question about moral good and evil over to the practical order. The principle essentially leads us into the realm of praxis, leads us most directly and most obviously, but with the support of a normative base. This normative base emerges at the deeper level of conscience. It involves, in fact, a theoretical recognition and acceptance of the truth of the moral good or evil. Hence, what is good has first the quality of truth rather than simply being that which is desired. What is so interesting here is the fact that Wojtyła grounds conscience's grasp of moral truth, the truth of what good and evil are, in a first, and we might say primordial level of theoretical reason. Because the recognition and acceptance of truth about the good is a work of conscience, Wojtyła believes that conscience functions both practically and theoretically. Hence, the element of internal acceptance and approbation of the truth of a moral good or evil we call conscience. And he says something similar in Person and Act, and I have a quotation, but I'll skip it because it's too long. Wojtyła, prioritizing the theoretical and arriving at the truth, then builds on a consciousness or experience of what is prior to praxis. Indeed, a central idea for Wojtyła is the traditional adage, operare sequitur esse, which for him offers the lapidary recognition that the act begins from the structure of the human person and of his social and religious context, and that its starting point entails both a recognition and acceptance of the good or truth value of that structure. Hence, the order of being of what is true is prior to the question of what is to be done, of what is good, not only in the metaphysical order, in other words, that I must be before I can act, or that something must be before it can be good, but also in his moral epistemology, in other words, that I can only know what is good by first knowing what is true. So we must say to know what is good depends on knowing in the act what is real. Yet this knowledge and acceptance of the truth of the good is also, as we have seen, the acceptance of a normative base. In other words, while the acceptance and approbation of the truth is fundamentally a theoretical question, it is nevertheless also normative because it is a truth about the good. It possesses in its very nature, in other words, a claim to or a demand for acceptance and approbation and its incarnation in act. It therefore also implies the binding nature of the truth about the human person and his wider social relationships, their religious meanings, and his relationship with God. So we have seen conscience's recognition and acceptance of the normative base occurs at the deepest level of conscience, which in fact Wojtyła characterizes as man's secret core. Human action in any estimation requires transcendence outward into the field of activity, into the world of real things, as it were. In this sense, it requires a kind of commitment to what is real in that field, to what corresponds to appetite and what is available for use as the objects or matter of activity. Wojtyła argues that this traditional teleological focus on appetite, while it is not incorrect, is nevertheless incomplete. Correlating with his theory of conscience, in fact, at its core, is a dual-layered understanding of transcendence. Wojtyła characterizes this volition and extension out towards objects of the act by the phrase horizontal transcendence, which is the moral agent's transcendence of himself when he crosses, in Wojtyła's words, the boundary of the subject toward the object of volition. This horizontal transcendence is intentional in the sense that it is object-oriented. The object gathers and focuses volition on the value it promises. If we leave things here, Wojtyła thinks, our understanding of human action seems to lack the moment in which the moral subject stands beyond and judges or determines these volitions. It would appear that without something more, horizontal transcendence would remain undirected and automatic, not fully free in the requisite sense. It would not possess sufficient depth to truly reveal the person, as Dr. Jolly was, I think, suggesting also, or saying in her paper. The problem with strictly teleological and moral doctrines, in other words, is that without more, they appear to give a truncated vision of the person. For this reason, Wojtyła thinks that the earlier philosophical ethics did not adequately address, or perhaps left overly implicit, the personalistic value of human action. Hence, he agrees with Kant's anti-teleological ethics in the limited sense that he seeks something more than the volition of particular objects of appetite to arrive at the fully personal values of self-determination and self-governance. It is the moment of choice captured by the phrase, I can but I need not, that is characteristic of human action. It is the moment that allows for self-governance and self-determination. For Wojtyła, this can only occur at a higher level. It is not the intentionality of volition alone, this is a quotation, that is the directing toward the objects that are in some way valuable, but the directing through decision or choice that is characteristic of the will. This is always a directing of the person. Hence, the transcendence that we owe to self-determination, the transcendence in the very fact of freedom, the fact of being free in action, and not merely by the intentional orientation of volitions towards an object of value, an object of value end that is proper to them, is what he calls vertical transcendence. It is here Wojtyła claims that acting and what merely happens in us are adequately distinguished. Vertical transcendence is encapsulated by the fundamental truth, I can, but I need not, and therefore stands above the level of the intentional grasp and volition of particular objects. And this vertical transcendence places a value in relation to truth, a relation that is interior and essential to the will itself and depends on truth. It is this dependence on truth that makes the will, this is a quotation from Person and Act, independent from objects and their presentation, he tells us. While giving the person superiority over his own dynamism, the superiority that we call transcendence in the act, the person is independent from the objects of his own action through the moment of truth contained in every authentic decision or choice. Wojtyła describes vertical transcendence somewhat paradoxically. As he puts it, we can call this dimension vertical transcendence for precisely in virtue of the relation to truth, in virtue of conscience, in which the relation is expressed and concretized, the man-person stands in a sense above his acting, choosing, and willing. He acquires a specific mastery over them. For Wojtyła, this entails a kind of superiority of man in relation to reality, to the objects of cognition. The paradox, so this always involves a kind of a paradoxical surpassing of the self. So there's a kind of paradoxical element of this, or standing above oneself. And it means that the transcendent platform on which the person himself can turn, it provides a transcendent platform on which the person can turn to the first value, which is the person himself in his relation to truthfulness. So there's a kind of first value, which is the person himself and his realization in the truth. The paradoxical standing above oneself is also the basis for claiming that personal destiny can be found in becoming oneself, or as he will later put it in his exhortation on the family, family, become what you are. It is this feature of vertical transcendence, its placement in the moral agent above himself, above his many provisional volitions, in destiny, to become fully himself, where he recuperates teleology in the form of what Wojtyła calls autoteleology. It is in this, the orientation of the person to fulfillment in truth, to measuring up to the meaning of transcendence and thereby becoming fully identical with himself, that the personal value of action is most profoundly realized. What the person in act really wants, his innermost appetite, we might say, is his own knowledge, acceptance, and fidelity to the truth of the good. He wants this because he wants, everyone wants, no matter how seriously they fall, to be good. Indeed, I gather that this impulsion to be and to be fully through one's choices and self-possession will later stand behind his social encyclicals, for example, prioritization of being over having. This is the basis for what Wojtyła calls the drama of human action. A drama because for the person in act, everything is at stake in action, as we shall see more completely in a moment. How can we assess this depiction of personal transcendence? Kenneth Schmitz astutely observed that this is surely an old insight given new life, namely the insight that it is neither the intellect that knows nor the will that decides, but it is the human person as acting person who recognizes, initiates, and determines. To act with efficacy is to integrate the rich complexity of the embodied human agent in a way that transforms him or her. However, if I'm not mistaken, the new emphasis in this old insight is the simultaneous interior and exterior gaze of the person in his act and the sense of his confrontation with truth as a condition for the action and for his being fully a person. As we've seen, Wojtyła agrees partly with Kant regarding the teleology of appetite. However, he disagrees with Kant's formalism, his radical separation of theoretical and practical reason, his nature from ethics, and so forth. In the spirit of medieval philosophy, in the context of showing the radical inadequacy of Plato's and Aristotle's philosophical ethics for Christianity, Etienne Gilson remarked that Kant's ethics are but a Christian ethic cut loose from the Christian metaphysic that justifies it, the still imposing ruins of a temple with undermined foundations. I think in a similar vein, Wojtyła tells us that it is not Kant that we owe the key to the cognitive manifestation itself of the transcendence of man in the ethical dimension of his action and existence. The obstacle in Kant was the radical break of human cognition into two mutually independent spheres, the sensual phenomena and the intellectual noumena. Key here is the recognition that the self-possession contained in this being above oneself in order to be oneself can only occur in relation to the truth of the good. According to Wojtyła, then, the primary work of conscience is not navigating difficult norms or even simply applying external norms to a concrete situation. Rather, its work is primarily the encounter with the truth of good, a good that is, first of all, the good of the person in relation not only to possible objects of volition, but to other persons and to God. And this encounter with the truth, the good that reveals, it is this encounter with the good that, with the truth of the good that reveals its normativity. In this sense, the normative value of the good is not imposed from outside in the way that McElroy envisions, but simply arises as a recognition of the truth. Indeed, he clarifies, Wojtyła clarifies that this dimension of transcendence proper to the human person is situated through the revelation to truth, the relation to truth, good, and beauty. The sense of truth here is not one-sidedly intellectual or rationalistic, but has a fuller character. It is not only a truth of thought, but at the same time a truth of action and a truth of the very being of the person. It is, in fact, a lived experience of value, which contains a cognition of the truth about the objects of our choice and striving. It is a truth that makes a demand on the moral agent, formed, Wojtyła tells us, on the basis of some kind of fixed gaze at ideal values, which must be realized in the corresponding act. The truth of the good is normative because it holds itself out as something to be realized. This knowing, the recognition and acceptance of truth is the essential condition for personal fulfillment, which is not primarily an achievement externally in the world, but a realization of the person who acts. In every act, if every act aims at some fulfillment at the metaphysical level, only good actions are fulfilling at the axiological level, he tells us. Moral evil is a kind of non-fulfillment at the level of the person as the subject of the will. In this way, Wojtyła tells us, man attains the end that he is for himself. He becomes the good that he is, and at the same time that he constantly should be. At stake are the alternatives, becoming equal to oneself or growing ever less than oneself. Everything that has been said up till now leads to the question of how the truth of the good or the normative base are to be defined. For this content, Wojtyła turns in man in the field of responsibility to both the natural law and the personalistic norm, the latter of which has been elaborated at length in Love and Responsibility. On Wojtyła's reckoning, the natural law and the personalistic norm interpenetrate and complement each other, even if he accords a certain priority, I think, to the personalistic norm as the way of knowing natural law. The personalistic norm, he tells us, is the primary principle of human acts, according to which all the actions of man in any field whatsoever must be adjusted in relation to the person. Yet the natural law is inscribed in nature as God's creation, which is structured by the eternal law, of which natural law is but a participation. The transcendence of man over nature does not mean separation from the order of nature, but rather signifies in the personalistic norm the possibility of knowing what man is, while at the same time knowing that his very constitution as a person is rooted in nature. These natural structures partly constitute the truth of the good, the normative base, since nature possesses normative implications when read through the lens of the personalistic norm. These natural structures partly constitute the truth of the good, the normative base, since nature possesses normative implications when read through the lens of the personalistic norm. And so, on the basis of natural law, what is required is the formulation of a principle or principles that fully correspond to that normative base. But this interpretation of natural law inscribed in human nature and the personalistic norm also opens the truth about the good to the new law, which offers a distinctive Christian morality. This background, he will famously say in Veritatis Splendor, with this background, he will famously say in Veritatis Splendor that the person, by the light of reason and the support of virtue, discovers in the body the anticipatory signs, the expression and promise of the gift of self, in conformity with the wise plan of the Creator. The entire framework will remain implicit in Veritatis Splendor's discussion of conscience. With these elaborations of the content of the truth of the good and the unfolding of the normative base into specific norms, we can perhaps see a way of shedding further light on conscience's meaning as offering the voice of God or of constituting a place for the conversation with God. As just mentioned, the personalistic norm entails a certain way of treating persons individually and informing human communities. It can be elaborated into basic meanings of justice, economic exchange, education, and law, as well as into the characteristics and structure of such primordial realities inscribed in nature from the beginning as marriage and family. As such, the interpenetration of natural law and the norm opens conscience to the creaturely origins of these communities and institutions. To understand these adequately presupposes responsibility not only to one's fellows and to larger communities, but also, Wojtyła tells us, to God. Indeed, both the natural law and its radical dependence on creatureliness and the personalistic norm itself rely for their conceptual integrity on givenness. At the radical origin of Wojtyła's philosophical account, there is in fact a Christian framework of faith and revelation. As he will put it later, in the different context of his pastoral work as Pope, the attempt to set freedom in opposition to truth, indeed to separate them radically, is the consequence, manifestation, and consummation of another more serious and destructive dichotomy, that which separates faith from morality. Person in Act declares on this basis that conscience, in its primary sense as a vertical transcendence, acquires a particular authority which permits us to think and speak of conscience as the voice of God himself. Or, as he puts it elsewhere, if conscience is also called the voice of God, it is because it reveals that in which man not only surpasses the horizontal boundaries of his subject, but also rises above them. But God's voice is above all an invitation. Indeed, we recognize that the horizons delineating the arena in which the person acts are most fundamentally marked out by the movement and aspiration of the creature in relation to that invitation. This is why in Veritatis Splendor he will tell us that the moral life is a response of love, which is due to the many gratuitous initiatives taken by God out of love for man. Here then also is a genuine dialogue between man and the creature and the Creator, delineated at first as an invitation and the correlative response, but also encountered in the framework of truth and its dramatic instantiation in human action. So just my conclusion here. Wojtyła's discussion of truth, of the truth of the good, and of the self-transcendence of the agent helps us to clarify a dimension of conscience that the recent discussions we began with typically neglect, namely the exact character of conscience's work in relation to the truth and moral law, or to put it differently, the mode of dialogue with God, which Veritatis Splendor and Gaudium et Spes both envision, but which is so very different from that suggested by Cardinal McElroy and others today. Indeed, without the objectivity of the truth, of the good, and all that it implies, it's hard to know precisely what the content and meaning of McElroy's idea of dialogue with God is, and how that moral agent can know that he is not, in fact, just talking to himself. More fundamentally, the trend, of which McElroy is only an example, has the pastorally ambiguous effect of draining the human act of its drama. That is to say, if we follow Wojtyła's argument, the human act under McElroy's understanding of conscience is less than fully an act, since it lacks the dramatic encounter with the truth of the good, which is the very basis for the free act even to be. And its lack in this regard is because the understanding of conscience lets the moral agent off the hook for his responsibility to the truth of the good. In this sense, the trend McElroy represents allows the human act to begin to slide into the subpersonal world of mere happening. Such a view of conscience tends, moreover, to allow a kind of defection from what is real, insofar as it truncates the anthropology Wojtyła describes and thereby obviates the standing above oneself in order to be oneself that is the hallmark of Wojtyłan freedom and its authentic engagement with the world of both things and persons. The fullness of the human act as depicted by Wojtyła is a binding of oneself through a commitment to a certain faith in the underlying character of reality, in an implicit knowledge, even in knowing that this act, here and now, is radically inadequate to the open-ended character of this commitment. And it is not until there is a concrete commitment to the whole, until the human person has committed himself to that vision, that one can truly said to have accepted it. It is only in acting in a commitment to the truth of the good that the world can become vibrant and therefore also really fully real, rather than remain colorless and hypothetical to the moral agent. In this sense, then, as an open-ended commitment to a vision of reality as a whole, a commitment in which the risk of the agent's existence is somehow taken up and engaged, genuine human action possesses the inner form or the interior structure of a commitment, a vow, and therefore also a dialogos. Indeed, the word response suggests the idea of commitment or pledge or vow through its Latin root respondere, which in turn is related to spondere, or to pledge or vow. Hence, a response is a pledge in return. Behind this commitment, this response to the world as it presents itself, there is always the invitation of another who has set our being in motion and calls us to himself. Thank you.